He was barely breathing, curled into a ball no bigger than a human infant. His tiny fingers clutched nothing. His eyes, dark, ancient, and terrified, scanned a world that had already taken everything from him. The jungle was gone. His mother was gone. The warmth he had known for the first weeks of his life had vanished in a single violent moment. And then she walked in. She was not a gorilla. She did not smell like one. She did not sound like one. She did not sound like one. Every instinct this baby had should have told him to retreat, to scream, to fight. But something happened in that moment that nobody in that room could explain. He reached up, a tiny wrinkled hand, trembling, searching, and he chose her, not the senior keeper, not the vet who had spent hours stabilizing him. Her, a young woman who had never worked with a gorilla in her life, who had walked into that enclosure only because no one else was available. She stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, and this baby, this shattered, orphaned, desperate little soul, grabbed her finger and held on like she was the last solid thing in a dissolving world. What happened next would change both of their lives forever. But to understand why, you need to go back to the beginning. The Virunga Highlands sit at the heart of Central Africa, where the mist never fully lifts and the trees grow so dense that midday feels like dusk. It is one of the last places on Earth where mountain gorillas still roam in the wild, powerful, silent giants moving through a landscape so ancient it feels like the planet's memory. Here, families are everything. A gorilla troop is not simply a group of animals sharing territory. It is a living, breathing community held together by loyalty, hierarchy, and a depth of maternal love that would be recognizable to any human parent. Mothers carry their infants for months without setting them down. They groom them, protect them, teach them. A baby gorilla knows nothing of the world except through the warmth of his mother's body. His name, given later by the sanctuary workers who would come to love him, was Kibo, named for the highest peak of Mount Kilimanjaro, distant, unreachable, and breathtaking. When Kibo arrived at the rescue sanctuary in Rwanda, he was approximately 6 weeks old. He weighed less than 4 pounds. His breathing was shallow and irregular. There were signs of dehydration, shock, and something the vets quietly described as grief. Yes, grief. Because gorillas grieve. Science has confirmed it, and anyone who has looked into the eyes of a traumatized infant primate has felt it without needing a study to prove it. The sanctuary, run by a small team of dedicated conservationists, had handled orphaned gorillas before, but Kibo was different. Even the most experienced staff member admitted it in hushed tones. There was something about him, something that felt like a question waiting to be answered. The story of how Kibo came to be alone in the world is one that plays out too often across Central Africa, and it never gets easier to tell. Poachers, not after Kibo himself, infant gorillas are not the primary target. They are the collateral, the unbearable, devastating collateral of a trade in wild animals that supplies black markets across 3 continents. Adult gorillas are killed, and the babies, too small and too helpless to survive alone, are taken, sometimes to be sold, sometimes simply left behind to die because they are inconvenient. Kibo was found by a ranger patrol 2 days after the attack on his family group. He was hidden in the undergrowth less than 30 meters from where his mother had been killed. He had not moved, he had not eaten, he had simply stayed beside the last place he had known safety, waiting for something that was never going to come back. The ranger who found him said later that the sound Kibo made when he was lifted, a low, trembling, almost human moan, was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. At the sanctuary, the first 72 hours were critical. Baby gorillas cannot regulate their own body temperature. Without constant physical contact, without the press of another warm body against theirs, they deteriorate rapidly. The team worked in shifts, holding Kibo, keeping him warm, trying to feed him through a small syringe every 2 hours. He refused most of it. He was not sick, exactly. He was heartbroken. And a heartbroken gorilla, cut off from everything his body and soul depended on, can simply stop trying to live. The vets had seen it before. That quiet surrender, that moment when the fight just goes out of a small animal's eyes. They were watching for it in Kibo, and on the 3rd night they began to see it. His temperature dropped, his grip loosened. The little fingers that had clutched so desperately at whoever held him began to go slack. The senior vet on duty made a quiet, devastating note in his logbook. Critical. Response to stimulation declining. That was the night she was called in. Her name was Amara, 24 years old. A recent graduate in conservation biology who had arrived at the sanctuary 3 weeks earlier as a volunteer. She had spent most of her time so far cataloging plant samples and helping with enclosure maintenance. She had been around the facility's older gorillas during supervised feeding sessions, but she had never worked directly with a critical infant case. The keeper scheduled for the overnight shift had fallen ill, and in the desperate reshuffling of a small understaffed team, Amara was asked if she was willing. She said yes before the question was fully finished. She pulled on her scrubs, read the briefing notes in the corridor, and pushed open the door to the medical unit. What she saw stopped her in the doorway. Kibo was lying in a padded incubator, wrapped loosely in a fleece that had been warmed to body temperature. His eyes were open but unfocused. The monitors beside him showed a heart rate that the notes described as concerning. He looked, Amara would say later, like a child who had given up on being found. She stood at the edge of the room and felt something she could not name. The senior vet gave her a brief handover. Keep him warm. Attempt feeding at 2-hour intervals. Note any changes. Call immediately if his breathing changes pattern. Then the vet was gone, and it was just Amara and Kibo and the soft hum of medical equipment in a quiet room in the middle of an African night. She did not consult a manual for what she did next. She simply picked him up, carefully, slowly, the way you would lift something irreplaceable. She held him against her chest, her heartbeat pressed against his tiny body, and she sat down in the chair beside the incubator, and she started to talk to him, quietly, not instructions, not clinical reassurances, just words, stories about where she grew up, the sound of her mother's cooking, the smell of rain on dry earth, things that meant safety to her, offered in a language he could not understand, carried on a frequency that somehow, impossibly he could. And that is when it happened. Kibo turned his head, not away from her, toward her, his cheek pressed into the warmth of her collarbone. One small hand reached up, that same trembling, searching gesture, and found her finger, and held on. The monitors showed his heart rate stabilizing within 20 minutes, but one night of warmth does not undo weeks of trauma. The days that followed tested both of them in ways neither could have anticipated. Kibo's physical condition improved slowly, agonizingly slowly, but his psychological recovery was far more fragile. Gorilla infants who lose their mothers in the first weeks of life can develop what behaviorists describe as attachment disorder. They become either dangerously clingy or, more perilously, entirely withdrawn. Kibo swung between both extremes. There were days when he refused to release Amara's arm for hours at a time, screaming at a pitch that rattled the windows when she had to leave the room. And there were other days, darker days, when he sat in the corner of his padded space and stared at nothing, unresponsive to touch, unreachable by any voice. The team watched these episodes with quiet professional concern, but Amara watched them with something rawer than that. She began spending every available hour with Kibo. Her officially scheduled shifts stretched into unofficial ones. She slept in the chair beside his enclosure on nights she was not rostered. The other staff noticed. Some of them worried. There is a protocol in wildlife rehabilitation that most experienced workers understand intuitively: the danger of forming attachments too deep, of becoming a surrogate rather than a bridge. The goal was always to prepare Kibo for integration with other gorillas. If he bonded exclusively to a human, that path would become infinitely harder. The sanctuary director sat down with Amara at the end of the second week. The conversation was gentle but clear. She needed to be careful. Kibo needed to be exposed to other gorillas. The bond forming between them was beautiful, but it could not be his whole world. The wild, or at least a protected semi-wild environment, had to remain the goal. Amara heard every word. She agreed with every word, and she went back to Kibo's enclosure and found him sitting in the corner, staring at nothing, and she felt the entire weight of what was being asked of her settle onto her shoulders like something made of stone. Because here is what nobody tells you about caring for a traumatized wild animal. The hardest part is not the fear that they will not survive. The hardest part is knowing that your job, if you do it right, is to one day make yourself unnecessary. And then came the setback nobody had planned for. In the fourth week, Kibo contracted a respiratory infection, not unusual in infant gorillas, whose immune systems are still developing, but alarming given how fragile his baseline health remained. His temperature spiked. His breathing became labored. He was moved back to the medical unit, placed back on monitoring, and for 48 agonizing hours the team did not know which way it would go. She sat outside the medical unit, not allowed inside during treatment, and she waited. Staff brought her food she barely touched. Someone left a blanket on the chair beside her. She sat through the night listening to the muffled sounds of veterinary work, and she prayed in 3 languages: her mother's, her grandmother's, and one she had invented somewhere in the terrified silence of the longest night of her life. He pulled through, slowly, stubbornly, in the way that some living things cling to the world as though they have decided, somewhere deep in the wordless part of themselves, that they are not finished yet. When Amara was finally allowed back into the room, Kibo was lying quietly in his incubator, his breathing even, his eyes open. He did not immediately react to her arrival. She stood in the doorway, exhausted beyond expression, and watched him. And she thought in one of those honest, unguarded moments that only extreme tiredness allows, that he looked like a question that had finally found its answer. She walked to the incubator. She reached in, and Kibo, without looking up, without any visible acknowledgement that he had even registered her presence, reached out and wrapped both of his small hands around two of her fingers. Not one hand this time, both. The vet standing behind Amara quietly left the room. Later she would tell her colleagues that she left because she did not want anyone to see her cry. The truth was that some moments are too complete to be witnessed by anyone except the people they belong to. Kibo held on, and Amara, for the first time in 4 weeks, let herself cry. Not from fear, not from exhaustion, but from something that had no clinical name and needed none. Relief is too small a word. Recognition is closer. The feeling that something had been fought for and won, not by force but by the oldest and most stubborn force there is. Presence, patience, love that does not ask to be understood. In the weeks that followed, Kibo's recovery was remarkable. The respiratory infection cleared completely. His weight climbed steadily. He began showing the first signs of playfulness, batting at hanging toys, vocalizing in the low, rumbling way that healthy young gorillas do, investigating the world around him with a curiosity that the staff recognized immediately as a profound sign of returning wellness. And slowly, carefully, the integration process began. Through a mesh partition, Kibo was introduced to Zawadi, a 9-year-old female gorilla at the sanctuary who had herself been orphaned years earlier and had since become a calm, stabilizing presence in the facility's social group. The first meeting was brief and carefully monitored. Zawadi approached the partition, sniffed the air, looked at Kibo with the measured, ancient intelligence of her kind. Kibo looked back. Then he made a sound, a soft, low, questioning sound that the most experienced keeper on the team had not heard from him before. She described it as something between a greeting and a recognition, as if some part of Kibo that had been waiting, that had been held in suspension, had finally stirred. The integration took 3 months. It was gradual and careful, and sometimes painfully slow, but it worked. Kibo found his place in the social group. He found in Zawadi's patient presence something that began to approximate the gorilla companionship his development required. He did not forget Amara. When she entered the sanctuary space, he would cross the enclosure to be near the boundary, to vocalize, to reach toward her if she came close enough. But he no longer needed her to survive. That, the director quietly told Amara one afternoon, was the definition of success. There is a moment in almost every genuine rescue story that is impossible to photograph. It is not the dramatic rescue itself. It is not the first feeding or the first step or the first sign of recovery. It is the quieter moment, days or weeks or months later, when you look at an animal who was once dying, and you see something in their eyes that was not there before. Not just health, not just safety, settledness, the look of a living thing that has decided the world is worth staying in. Kibo has that look now. He is thriving in the sanctuary's extended habitat, part of a small social group that includes Zawadi and 2 younger males who arrived in the years that followed. He is, by all behavioral assessments, a psychologically healthy young gorilla with strong social bonds and what the team laughingly calls an opinion about everything. He is curious. He is occasionally stubborn. He has a particular fondness for certain keepers and a particular talent for communicating his displeasure when feeding time is late. He is, in other words, magnificently, stubbornly, irreducibly alive. Amara completed her volunteer placement and went on to study primate rehabilitation at a postgraduate level. She returns to the sanctuary twice a year, and every time she does, a certain young gorilla makes his way across the enclosure to be near her. But he has not forgotten. There is something in that, in the specific tenderness of a bond that was formed in desperation and survived into something gentler, that speaks to a truth larger than any one story. We tell ourselves that the line between humans and animals is fixed and clear, that we are the caretakers and they are the cared for, that the exchange is one-directional, and then a 6-week-old gorilla reaches up in a darkened room and grabs the finger of a young woman who is just as afraid as he is, and holds on. The question we asked at the beginning, what would you do if a creature with nothing left chose you as its only anchor, has no clean answer. Amara did not have a plan. She did not follow a protocol. She sat in a chair and told a grieving infant about the smell of rain and her mother's cooking, and she stayed. That is the whole story. And it turns out that sometimes, staying is enough. Sometimes staying is everything. In the highlands of Central Africa, where the mist never fully lifts, and the trees remember things we have forgotten, A young gorilla is learning to be wild again. He carries with him the marks of everything he has lost. He carries also the mark of everything that found him. Both are part of who he is now. Both always will be.